I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
All right, well, welcome back to another episode of Dust Bowl Diatribes. We're going to be interviewing Laurie to talk about her newly released book, The Gap in God's Country. And we're joined with this by our friend Caleb, who recently finished his doctoral work at Oxford. And the first thing he wanted to do hot out of the gates was to talk about this book.
Yes, when I graduated from Oxford recently, no, I didn't do that. But I'm happy to be here. I don't fully know why I'm here, other than I like you guys. What I did think was kind of cool though is that like reading this book, I felt like I was piecing together like the last 4 years of getting to know you guys. I mean, I think I moved here in 2020 and met Spencer pretty early on, met Laurie along the way, and it's been like 4 years of every week, every month, you guys are just like on some new thing. Like, oh, we're moving from Marx to distributism to now we're interested in Burke, whatever. And it all came together here, which was cool. So I'm excited to talk about the book.
So I guess, Laurie, how would you introduce the central thesis? Or there's arguably multiple theses, but how would you describe the book?
Okay, well, I mean, yeah, like I've given some thought to that. Like, what's the main point I want to make? And I think that the main point, if I had to just pick one, is when people are, because the book is about our culture wars, it's about, the deep divides that we have in the United States right now. And people get caught up on what I consider to be kind of the surface arguments. And they kind of like look at the opponent as the other, the enemy, right? Right away, they're reactive. And of course, I talk about Christians in this book. They have a tendency to do that, just like a lot of other Americans. But there's just a lot of Christians or people who identify as Christians in America. Anyway, the first thing that you need to ask when you see your neighbor sort of acting in what you consider to be an aberrant way is what's wrong, not what's wrong with you. Right? What's wrong? What's wrong? Right? Ask like, what is bothering? What is upsetting you? What is making you feel as though you need to act out or you need to, become more extreme in your political views one way or the other? Because I think always when people become more extreme in their political views or ideology, it's because something is deeply wrong. A lot of times at a personal level in their own experience of life. And that's why at the beginning of the book, I tell my own personal story in which I, started off life as a kind of a liberal Democrat back in Rock Island, Illinois, working class community, raised by my mom and dad. My dad's influence in particular was, very liberal Democrat. But at a certain point, I got kind of indignant because I had had a lot of neighbors in that community who were poor, who were, members of minority groups that were being neglected. And Democrats would speak to them, but they wouldn't be able to actually seemingly do anything really concrete for them because their situation would remain the same. And I got attracted to the Republican Party. But the reason why I switched ultimately to the Republican Party was even more because when I went out to get interviewed for jobs, first time, when I was interviewing for a professor type job, the fact that I wanted to teach classics like Thucydides, Plato, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, was greeted by a lot of the people interviewing me as politically incorrect, as something that a woman shouldn't do. People were not nice to me. They treated me meanly. And my response to that was finally to say, well, like, screw that. I don't need you guys. Like, I'm going to do the opposite. Right. And so that's what ultimately made me flip from liberal Democrat to conservative Republican, was the fact that my feelings were hurt. Okay. Not so much the other more concrete reason. The Democrats don't pay too much attention to minorities and poor people, which is true and still is. I'm hoping it will change, but probably won't. But it was more like the personal insult to me. I'm like, well, like, if you're going to be like this, if you people aren't going to like me, then I'm going to be your worst enemy. And so, I mean, that to me, I think that is a fairly common story, is that people make these flips and they're not as deeply well thought out as they are emotional. And they have to do with, being defensive and, sticking it in other people's eyes and making people angry because you've been hurt. So I acknowledged that in myself in the introduction. And, later on in my life, I have reevaluated again, right? And that shows you that it wasn't that my political opinion was all that deeply set into my character. It had a lot to do with my emotions. And I think that's what it is for most people. Most people have, if they flip or if they become more extreme, it's because something has happened in their life, oftentimes of a very personal nature, right? Where they felt insulted or they felt demeaned or degraded or, neglected or something like that, that has basically made them angry. And so I think a lot of people today are very angry for a lot of these types of reasons. So we can get into it more, but that's the big takeaway I want people to get.
I guess before we get any further, earlier on, you noted how you view extremism as a fundamental problem. How would you define that? And then what would you say to the people that say that actually the kind of solutions you're putting forward are a species of extremism?
Well, that would be, mean I'd have to unpack all of these solutions, which we'll get to, I'm sure. But I would define extremism as when a person becomes ideologically possessed. My previous book, Ideological Possession and the Rise of the New Right, utilized the psychological theory of Carl Jung and, tried to tell this story about that point at which people become kind of galvanized in an ideological mass, right? And when they do, then they lose their moral rudder, right? Like they're not able to see the human beings in front of them. Instead, they see the ideology as paramount and the human beings as secondary, and as to sort of like either those human beings are going to mold themselves to that vision, or they're gonna like they need to be eliminated. Um, and so, at a lower level, right? And we're not talking about Nazism or communism or something like that. It could mean like seeing people as obstacles, as in instrumental terms. Also, there's a level of paranoia that occurs in extremism, where you go from being able to reason and say, like, I think this is right, but I also see these other issues that you're talking about as having some legitimacy, to, if you say to me that I'm not completely right, you are the enemy. You're part of the problem. You're part of the overall conspiracy that is like blocking the path of my like ideological vision, right? And so there's a certain amount of paranoia there, and you see a lot of that paranoia today, where there's countervailing like information that comes at people, and instead of being able to kind of absorb that and sort through it and say, this is, at least partly right, this is what I agree with, this is what I don't, they say, you disagree with me, you are part of a major conspiracy of some kind, because I know what's right, and you aren't mirroring that back to me, so you have to be a part of that. And then a lot of the intellectual energy then gets put into creating and maintaining the conspiracy, if that makes sense, rather than sorting through the facts and the information and the arguments and having the humility to kind of like, admit and give way on certain areas. So I guess that's how I would define extremism.
I guess you want to unpack a bit what you see as fundamentally underlying the culture wars in America, the gap, if you will.
Yeah, so I look at a lot of different factors, right? But if I had to choose the big one, it would be technological changes that have been taking place since the Industrial Revolution. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, and in this, I don't disagree with Wendell Berry, who's well, maybe people think he's a radical. Anyway, Wendell Berry is sort of a classical conservative of sorts, but I agree with Wendell Berry that, with the Industrial Revolution, you get this unending change, right? And it's the market imperatives of industrial capitalism, and now in post-industrial capitalism, force people to shift and change and disembed and dislocate, or I also refer to this as root shock, when people are basically making their decisions about where they will live, who they will live with, even who they will marry, who they will basically work for, what kind of work they will devote their lives to, how they will train themselves. All of that is circles around market imperatives, meaning economic demands that are out of your control. Okay, that leads to a lot of mass migration, a lot of psychological dislocation too, and a lot of people's lives being turned over to mechanisms that they feel are beyond their control. Now, a lot of people in our modern society are so used to this that they don't actually fully fathom why they feel such discontent. I go back in the book to like the time not that long ago in the United States where a lot of people were much more rooted, and where they were much more, there were many more people living off the land. Or if they weren't living off the land, they were living off of the economy created by people who were living off the land and doing local agricultural activity to like support themselves and other people in their area, where there were more small businesses, where there were more like intact communities. Okay. And in those situations, people would feel psychologically more stability, more of a sense of embeddedness and purpose, right? Not everything would be up for grabs and questioned, and their future wouldn't necessarily be constantly questioned. In our current environment, and this is what makes our current environment different from even what Marx would have anticipated. Even people who make a very good living, middle class, upper middle class, even some wealthy people can probably honestly say they don't know if this will always be the case. That your job could be eliminated, the stock market could go down, the trends may change in what people want to consume. Automation may literally eliminate your $150,000 a year programming job. And then you could be in the same situation. And when we drive through the streets of any city of any size, I'm in a city of like 50 or 60,000 people. We've got homeless people here in Kansas City where you are. There's a lot more homeless people. And as you drive by them, they're not totally invisible, Spencer. Actually, they're actually your vision of where you could be if the economy shifts and changes, so that your like knowledge and your expertise and experience don't matter anymore. So I think we all kind of like have this sense of existential dread, basically, and insecurity, even if we're making decent money. And then as that income goes down, the insecurity goes up, or, the term that I use in the book is precarity. And that lack of sense of security and belonging and embeddedness is what I think is driving this. It's driving this anger, frustration, paranoia, discontent, whatever you want to put it. People want some change, but they're embedded enough in this current system that they don't know exactly what that change should look like.
And I thought it was interesting how you explored some reactions to that, especially among, I guess, like middle class people who might be like turning, I guess, to politics or to like Catholic traditionalism, right? As this kind of like desperate, panicked attempt to restore a false sense of security in a history that never existed, right? But
Mm-hmm.
the role playing seems to satisfy people. And I guess the weekly aesthetic experience of a 2 hour Latin mass or whatever restores a brief semblance of order to people's lives. And you were very critical of those kind of wind back the clock approaches. And you were equally critical, I think, of what I hear from a lot of well-meaning people, um, who say things like, if only we could just get people back in the churches, things
Hmm.
would be better. If only we could get people, back in their rural communities, things would be better, But you don't seem to think that that in and of itself is a viable solution. And I'd be kind of interested to hear you speak to why.
Yeah. So, I mean, first, yeah, like I am critical of traditionalists who sort of the LARPing traditionalist, I guess you might say, and I would say the same thing of people who are like very fundamentalist, and their Protestant Christianity as well, who are kind of like sequestering themselves and their kids off from the world and not letting them be exposed to the reality of life. Life moves on, technology moves on. We might not like it. We can acknowledge the damage that it does, and also the benefits also that can accrue from that change. So I am one who doesn't think we can go back, and maybe in some ways we shouldn't go back, because to go back also might include gender roles that are really bifurcated, where, men are in charge. And I'm famous for basically saying, there's no proof that men being in charge fixes anything, So, I just don't think that's possible or desirable. What is desirable is for us to rethink how we do things now, so that grappling with what currently exists, including all of the, the sort of like the good and bad of the capitalist economy, that we can, make things better. And so, I mean, that's a big, tall order. So I do kind of concentrate on churches in part of my book. And I ask the question, like, what is the role of a church in this situation? And the reason why I don't think just going back to a church is going to make things remarkably better is because a lot of churches have adopted the liberal model of just basically providing services for people, giving them the Sunday service, giving them, maybe, a few events a year, maybe a little bit of a service opportunity that they might have. But a lot of churches could go a long ways further in developing actual community with people. And that never did exist. One of the things that I found in my research in American history is that uh, most American churches, anyway, never were very good at creating communities. Some of the people that I interviewed were people who remembered what church was like in the 1930s and 40s. And they said, well, we went on Sunday and then we went home, like we did things for each other, but the church had nothing to do with it, like we just knew when to show up when when a neighbor had trouble or during harvest time or whatever. But the church was not, their primary vehicle. So I'm asking for something, and I think, Spencer and I, both agree on this. Like, we're asking for churches to take a much more active role, and especially church leaders, right? Not just the people, but the leaders, to actually try to create a context in which people can form solid communities. And that doesn't just mean sitting around a table and talking about books, even though that's really good and I like doing it. It means literally helping each other, without money, without the sort of charity model being the primary means of helping people, but helping each other directly. That takes a lot of leadership. And so I think the churches could kind of lead the way in teaching people how to be like better community members and better neighbors towards each other.
I guess I'm interested in like what does that look like in the sense of when I think of like the kind of ideal of a congregation that has this sort of neighborly interdependence and is in this more genuine form of community than we see each other once a week and eat a donut after mass or whatever. I guess like I can see that playing out differently in different churches. I think especially when I think of like some of the um I don't know, lower income, maybe like Hispanic parishes around here where we're talking about immigrant populations and people living in genuine precarity. There's other layers of interdependence too that force the church into a different role. I also think of people who maybe fit our profile, who I've seen try to go out of their way and create this new vision of parish community, and it looks kind of foolish and falls flat, when it's like
Sure.
this we're contrived thing, right? Where again we have like mostly middle class people trying to create these communities through I don't know. I'm not going to be too specific about what I have in mind because I don't want to offend anybody, but
Sure, let me do that.
yeah.
um, I'll give you an example, and this is something I do talk about in the book. During COVID, well, before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID, my dad and dad's like 97, but my mom was like a year younger. And she was slipping over time, physically and mentally. We went to dad's church. I went to dad's church, actually, and asked the pastor for some visit, from like members of the church. Um, and nothing happened, honestly, nothing happened. Then, like, the pastor changed. I asked again. we got like a couple of visits. We didn't get anything. Basically, there wasn't the follow through. And what we got was sometimes like a card, a bouquet of flowers. What my dad was looking for, and I myself was looking for, was some respite, some like other person who could spend some time with mom. Now, to kind of, and believe me, like the lesson we got from that was that church is empty. But like if you step back from that, the larger insight there is that a lot of people who have elderly parents, their parents are not ready for a nursing home, but they do need some help. They need somebody to be there part of the time. And a church full of people has a lot of people in that situation of having elderly parents who need somebody to just kind of like hang with them a little bit, or maybe do a little bit of shopping, but definitely like just hang with them and spend some time with them. And if parishes did this, thousands and millions and millions of dollars wouldn't have to be spent on alienating, dehumanizing elderly housing in, facilities that they don't need to be in yet, because nobody is there for them full time. It's too much to ask like a working person to also 100% take care of their parent. Okay. But there's this middle area where the parent can still do a lot on their own, but they do need a little bit more support than what the kid can provide. And so the fact that churches don't do this because they can't cooperate, the people in them aren't enough of a community that they can cooperate with each other and provide this service to each other, speaks volumes to like the level of community that they don't have. Right. And in order to make that happen, you would have to have somebody in a leadership role actually prioritize the lives of the elderly people in their parish or in their body of people, prioritize them and try to organize people so that they can provide this to each other, which would build up community. So, and by the way, a poor person can provide that service. A person without any money can do that. Now, if the pastor is asking them to write a check so that they can pay for an elder care facility to house another person, that's a tall order for a poor person who doesn't have a lot of money. But a poor person may be able to spend 4 hours with your mom and probably, and then that erases money from the equation. Too often churches are treating the world as though there's two types of people, those with money and those without money. And those with money write checks to provide services that the economy provides to those who are poor. But they don't welcome those poor people who are service receivers real jovially into their Christian body, right? But if they saw them as, and this is where, maybe the scene's a little crass, but if you saw this human being not as just a taker, but as a potential giver, then maybe you actually have like a friend instead of a charity recipient, right? And then that person's financial status wouldn't even really matter. In fact, not at all. Wouldn't have mattered to me at all. What would have mattered to me is that somebody was there with my mom. So, I mean, I hope that kind of helps.
Right. I always think about in The Unsettling of America, where Barry talks about how agriculturally, and you tend to draw agricultural parallels between what's happening in the wider society and what's happened with how we produce our food, where he talks about how we took a solution, which was we need crops that need fertility and we have animals that poop out fertility. And we had integrated farms for most of human history. And then we divorced those things and we created two problems, which is mass feeding operations with shit lagoons on one end, and then farms that need fertility on the other that are then supplied by factories, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, what you're describing is that we basically have old people that we're not able to exploit money out of, on the one hand, and then we have the yous, which we also haven't yet, for the most part, figured out how to exploit. I mean, yeah, they can be consumers, but they can't really produce unless we just peel back labor laws. And it's, for me, I'm in the process of accepting that we live in a dark age where this divorce, we don't have the imagination to even conceive of this divorce, let alone begin to act concertedly to remarry, if that makes sense.
Right.
Bring the two back together, bring the division back together, as it were.
Right. Yeah. Well, and kind of to echo what Caleb said at the beginning, this book is a product of years of engagement with you and other people in the Morin Academy, but before it was even in the Morin Academy. And that, parallel wasn't lost on my mind. I've learned a lot about economics and about, modern thought because I've engaged with you and other people. And this book really is kind of like my attempt at a summary of the best parts of that engagement. And it really is true that we've been trained to basically divide all these functions up because the functional division creates more, opportunity for profit. And we become used to that to the point where, we will say, well, oh, if I have to, I will accept help from my, son or whatever. But I'd rather, not burden him or other people with my problem. And I'd rather have the service provider because that's more dignified. When actually, the opposite is true, that it's dehumanizing and it's kind of undignifying to be ignored by, your son or daughter or your friends, or to be underserved by, the people in your community in favor of some, faceless corporation that can provide these things for you. And that is the cognitive dissonance that people live in today that I think is part of why we have, basically I'm trying to make the case where we have like free floating anxiety, like generalized social anxiety that's caused by these kinds of, weird divisions, right? Like where things should go together, like, instead of having the shit lagoon, you should have like cows just shitting on, your land, and that creates more fertility, which then yields the next crop of cattle food or human food, and the cycle continues because that's how God made nature, right? At the heart of this is like a sort of natural law notion of the way God made the world, right? God put into the world these cycles of fertility in the case of nature and of human agriculture. And he also put into place these relationships of dependency and mutual aid in the part of human society as well. And we've fragmented that and introduced technical rationality into the process. And that's extremely dehumanizing. And, at this point, we have artificial intelligence actually even further dehumanizing by basically starting to govern these relationships without even a human programmer being in the mix, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know if there was a question in there, but I like resonate with what if there was a question in there? Not necessarily.
I guess the question was throughout the book and somewhat throughout this interview, but definitely in the book, you keep using the word we. And who is the we? It's like
it's humanity.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like what you're laying out is a history of how humanity has been vivisected.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've done it to ourselves, right? But the tragedy is we created this economic system, although it kind of happened to us. One of the things I do in the book is I cover the enclosure movement in England. I go back to the beginning of where At least, some theorists, the ones that I actually think are right. Obviously, like Ellen Miskins Wood is somebody that I use quite a bit in this part of the book. So I go back to the enclosure movement in England when the aristocracy decided that it was more profitable for them to put walls around their land to shut out the commons, to get rid of the commons, so that the peasants couldn't use it to, feed themselves as well as serve the aristocrats. They kicked the peasants off the land and they started to engage in commerce through tenant farming. So they became landlords basically, and they rented the land out to the person who could pay the highest rent, and that created imperatives of a nature that were very hard to ignore. The tenant who had the best technology, the best labor organization, the marketable crop, or animals, whatever it was that they were producing, like wool with sheep, or whether it was some sort of crop, that they had what would make the most money so that they could pay the most rent. Once that dynamic got started, then without thinking about it too much, which I don't think most people did most of the time throughout human history, they weren't projecting real far into the future. We try to do that now, which is encouraging, but even so, we do a bad job. But then they were relatively sort of unconscious about this situation driving them. So these people were competing with each other, right, for the use of this land. And this just created kind of unbearable pressures for them to produce whatever it took for them to make enough profit to pay for that land. And of course, then the market in land became a thing in and of itself. Pretty soon, finance capital is born, and that's the system that we've been in for ever since. In a way, you're born into it. The imperatives are very strong. If you want to survive, you need money, right? Because most people don't have land, and if they do, they don't know how to produce enough that will actually like feed them and give them the things that they need. So we are all kind of wage laborers, even if we're a salaried people, right? We're making money in order to now get everything we need, which means, for instance, in my case, like upper middle class, professional, but I do have to concern myself with what's marketable, right? I have to constantly think about, am I justifying my position by how many students are there and what kind of marketable skills they can obtain? Or maybe my position may be eliminated, right? So there's really no refuge in this dynamic. Even if people make different levels of income, there's always that demand that you be marketable. But it's much more powerful in people who are living close to the edge, where they're literally it sounds cliche, but it's the truth, one paycheck away from being evicted. In that case, they feel like they have no choice. But on the other side, the capitalist side, they also feel like they have no choice, right? Like if they're going to stay in business, if they're going to, in the case of corporations, serve their shareholders by paying a dividend, they've got to continue to be competitive. And so we have created a system which it does not benefit our ultimate well-being in any way, health-wise, environmentally, psychologically, in any way, but it totally makes sense in the moment. And you do feel as though you need to conform in order to survive.
No, you call this, you focus 2 chapters on what you call strong arming, where basically people are, even if they're told they're free, it's really a kind of blackmail. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's the chapter on ideological strong arming and then one on religious strong arming. And, and they're intertwined in American culture for sure. But I go back in the ideological strong arming chapter and discuss Milton Friedman, which you introduced me to his video series quite a while ago, Free to Choose. And as I watched this, I realized how, like, weirdly, PBS like allowed Milton Friedman to use it to sort of propagandize the American public about free market capitalism. And that became like the ideology that was acceptable in the United States, and it became a kind of religion. And the most interesting thing I learned about Friedman was that Friedman thought of it as a religion and actually said so. And I do provide proof for that, right? So he called it a new faith, and he wanted that new faith to edge out a more traditional faith. Uh, because he thought it made more sense. And he thought that it would benefit people more. I think he actually thought that. Um, but as time went by, that ideological strong arming became pretty ubiquitous, right? And so, in the Reagan era, for instance, it became very powerful. To make these kinds of arguments. And obviously, like Margaret Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society. And anybody who disagrees with me is stupid or just doesn't care about people and doesn't want economic growth to happen and is a communist, right? And that was the ultimate bludgeon, was if you don't agree with me, you're a communist. Well, people are like social creatures, and they don't like to be bludgeoned with like name calling and, demonizing. And so that's strong arming. That's basically, psychological compulsion. And people are really susceptible to it. And then I follow that up with, the chapter on religious strong arming, in which I highlight John MacArthur's Grace Community Church, right? But it stands in for a lot of other churches in American society that have embraced the neoliberal, until recently, and then with Trump, things changed. But like this whole neoliberal ideology they embraced. And they moved it forward into this is the Christian position. There's a lot of confusion now. They still don't really fully think that I don't know. I don't know exactly what they think, but like Trump doesn't quite represent that rhetorically. He certainly represents it in reality. But anyway, they've embraced this economic and political agenda, and they've made it part of their religion. And they've made Jesus, basically like one of the books that I reviewed for this, into John Wayne, and Jesus is a capitalist. And so in churches like that, and if somebody asks, like, why am I not like buttonholing leftist churches quite as much? Because right-wing churches are actually ascendant, and they are obviously politically powerful at this point. But left-wing churches can do the same sort of thing. So the dynamic is, if you don't like agree with this whole political ideology and this notion of Jesus, then you are not a part of our community, and you are going to be ostracized. The pressure that people feel, because they've gone into these churches with a desire for community. They're alienated. They're in the environment that I've described, where community is very hard to find, where belonging and love is very hard to find. So they go into these churches thinking that, oh, I've found community, I've found love, In a lot of cases they do. They find, their spouse. They find people who they can be friends with. They may even find their job. In a lot of cases, that this is their whole social network, and so they get a job this way. Now, if you have an errant thought against the capitalist system, against the whole patriotic ideology, or whatever ideology it is that's prevalent at the time, you are now outcast. You lose everything. That's religious strong arming. It's powerful. So when we, might say, oh, why do people go down that path, right? Like, why do they not just stand up and understand that the Christian religion doesn't mean that you have to be a particular type of Republican, or, that you have to be a capitalist? It's because if they don't believe that, they're going to be persona non grata, right? So like Václav Havel, back in the days of communism, as the communist regime was starting to collapse. Havel said, he told this story about this grocer. He was trying to get at the mindset of the person, in this case of communist, totalitarianism. What makes the decent person who has a mind of their own nevertheless conform? How do they do it? And he said that this grocer would put in his window, "Workers of the world unite," right? Even though he kind of knew that he was screwed basically by the system, barely getting by. The workers of the world were not going to be on his side because there were no workers of the world at that point. It was just, Gorbachev or whoever it was that was in power, Yeltsin. There was a whole cavalcade of people going through there. And he said that the reason why he did that is because he wanted to feel like he was a free and independent human being while totally kneeling down before the powers that be. Okay. And I think that this is what's going on now when people fly the flag. It's a way of feeling like I'm a patriotic American. I love Jesus. I'm a capitalist. Don't hurt me. Don't take away my relationships. Please keep me employed. Don't take away every shred of community I've got, which is pretty flimsy. So I mean, but you could do the same. I've just given you an example of how this happens on the communist side. It's a more general issue. And I think that in our liberal ideology, we don't want to believe people are such social creatures. They could be strong-armed in this way. But that's why I go through and talk about cults and some of the incredible cults that people have been sucked up into. Like rational people who get sucked up into cults and will do the most incredible, crazy things to be in this cult because they feel like they belong. So this is a very, very powerful political force in the world that we have super underestimated because we're liberal in we meaning like our society is liberal, and we believe as a faith that individuals make free-willed choices. They don't. They don't. And, time and time again, this is proven to be true. If we could, the world would probably be a better place, but we don't. And so people like sociopaths and people adjacent to sociopaths take advantage of this tendency in human psychology to form powerful movements and mass movements and churches that manipulate and abuse people.
So we've been dwelling on the negative side, but especially the last two chapters, you take great pains to kind of lay out what positive vision of what of basically renewing humanity would look like. And you spent a lot of time talking about the Catholic worker. I'd be interested to hear you expand on that, and then what Caleb thinks, given that he's had some involvement with the Catholic worker as it exists here in Kansas City.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'd like to hear Caleb's view on that too. I treated the Catholic worker as kind of like a case study for how Christians and people who are in the same zone would kind of go about acting out more direct action, right? Mutual aid, and so it's an example that's external to the Catholic Church or any other church, right? The Catholic workers they're not organized by the Catholic Church or any other church, which is maybe too bad, but I don't know. Like, people disagree about that. But they try as best they can, and they've been around since the 1930s, to serve the poor through direct action, not writing checks, but like actually using their labor and getting the things that they need from other people to then help the poor. And of course, there's Catholic worker farms like you and I guess like we have in Kansas City, the JP2 farm. Like, and Cherith Brook would be an example of Catholic worker house of hospitality there in Kansas City, right? But in the chapter, I just point out that Catholic workers are still a part of this larger capitalist system and part of the liberal dynamic. And so it's not a criticism of Catholic worker, but it's just a statement of reality and kind of like the tragedy of our reality that there would be no Catholic worker house of hospitality if other people weren't writing checks because they had a lot more income, and there wouldn't, or there were like grocery stores and corporate providers who could provide the food. If there weren't people's leftover clothing from our excessive like spending on clothing to be able to have a lot of excess that people could take advantage of. So, in a lot of ways, Catholic worker is still kind of in that charity mode because the situation is such that it's very difficult, and you know this from the farm. It's very difficult to get people to cooperate mutually, right? Like to actually to be able to, work together in a real sense is more difficult than getting people to just sort of donate, right? So that's kind of the tragic side of Catholic worker. But Catholic worker is like probably one of the most serious attempts that we have going for moving against the system that we've been describing here and directly taking action, not relying on government, not relying just on, service providers, but actually, taking action directly to like be with other people in community and help other people. It's just seriously fraught with like lots of issues because of the system, the overall system that we live in.
Yeah, and I guess like all of that kind of rings true. Like you can't operate um an effective and consistent Catholic worker house, which we think about the hospitality houses, we're essentially looking at soup kitchens plus some community. You know, you get more out of a Catholic worker hospitality house than you get out of just a, standard soup kitchen or whatever, or kind of industrial style charity. But you're right. I mean, it depends upon donations and is part of the basic liberal charity model, and also has that kind of liberal church culture of if you're a volunteer, you're going to show up a couple times a week and then go back out into the world. And um, I think at times I've been very critical of that. I mean, if you're holding Catholic worker movement up to the standards of like, I don't know, the Book of Acts or something, I mean, clearly it falls short of, pure Christian community. And if you're holding it up against the standards of, more hardcore kind of anarchist demands, right? It clearly falls short and is wrapped up in all of this complicity with the liberal capitalist order and yada yada yada. And I think I used to get more fed up with that. Just like, what I'll hear a lot of people in the Catholic worker movement say, maybe as a means of justifying their own kind of inefficacy, is, well, we don't expect everyone to become a Catholic worker. We see ourselves as leaven or yeast, right? People are going to come in and then permeate the existing institutions of the world and transform them from within. And we have to start with the revolution of the heart and blah, blah, blah. And that all sounds good. It also has a tendency to sound a little naive. And then, but you do think though, like, I mean, I teach and I volunteer and participate in community events at the Catholic Worker House here. And, you can borrow things from those experiences and bring them into your day-to-day life that multiplied could have a potentially transformative effect. I mean, like you can borrow Catholic worker concepts of decision making by consensus and authority and incorporate those into a classroom to some extent, and that, or you could incorporate them into your leadership model at your school or your nonprofit or whatever. And all of that seems like an improvement on the otherwise alienating structures and systems we find ourselves within. And when you think about, I mean, I don't think it's any accident that you connect this, to, I think, your more practical kind of proposal, which is this distributist inspired model of kind of just property redistribution and wealth redistribution and decentralization, right? Because when you think about how could we make that palatable to wide swaths of the American public? I think like actually decentralization can and should be a winning message for people. People feel distant from political decision making and could stand to benefit from more proximity to their economic and political situation, but at risk of giving some stuff up, and at risk of giving up access to some products and other things. And so I think like the experience you have volunteering at a Catholic worker house or farm and just trying to live and see people and things differently is also important for that, right? It promotes a level of detachment from just consumer culture and forces you to look the other in the eye and start to dismantle some of those artificial boundaries that, all of that does seem to be a prerequisite to any kind of practical political reform. So I don't know. I mean, I know like Spencer and I have had some cynical conversations about the aims and means and possibilities of the contemporary Catholic worker movement. And yet, you know, um, I do think there's some promise even under these limitations that you lay out kind of in the book.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they are one of the countervailing tendencies. Like Eugene McCarraher, in his book, The Enchantments of Mammon, talked about these tendencies throughout basically Anglo-European and now American history. Well, European and American history that are like pinpoints of resistance, basically. And that remind people that there's this, he calls it the beloved community, that the beloved community is kind of like this alternative that you can kind of glimpse through those pinpoints. And as such, they're kind of protests and they're reminders of our humanity. And I think that the Catholic worker movement definitely serves in our world today as that. I mean, no, it's not perfect, but it's like one of the better attempts at some sort of resistance, and it reminds people of their humanity. So, I mean, I'm mainly positive about it, but I mean, this kind of like brings me to another aspect of the conclusion and some of the recommendations that I try to make beyond, church leadership. I go to the level of the nation state. And I mean, honestly, like, yes, distributism is something that I explore because it does involve legislative action would have to be in place that basically broke up corporations, redistributed an amount of property and land to create more self-sufficiency amongst more people, and also advocate for spreading population by incentivizing return to local areas through, continuing with our effort to get wireless out to like the most rural areas so people can relocate because more and more people are working online remotely. And, those are also not like world changing proposals, but they are things that might help. But ultimately, I personally remain convinced that that, I mean, I'm just going to lay my cards on the table. I ultimately remain convinced that democratic socialism would be a context in which people could make further changes in the direction of creating community. They could still take advantage of what's been developed that's good in the capitalist system and wouldn't completely eliminate capitalism, but which could actually create a context in which we still would have to like work to create community, but where we wouldn't be as constantly compelled to work against it. So I'm still an advocate of that position. I've been pretty consistent on that for years, actually now. And it's not because democratic socialism is the like be all and end all of human existence, but it is something that other countries have accomplished in one degree or another, and that actually has worked to create better community amongst people and more of a social attitude. So we have proof that it can happen, and whether it could ever happen in the United States, well, if things get bad enough in the United States, believe me, it could happen totally. And we have examples that we can follow. And under those examples, we could have a context in which people could have more legitimate conversations about what else to do to create community and, mutual aid. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I guess though where I'm not feeling good about that possibility right now is just like how much time has been spent talking about the possibility of democratic socialism in America
Mm.
while, we continue to dig ourselves deeper and deeper into the hole. And, like in the past 8 years, how many occasions have there been on which, we might think, okay, this is the tipping point, right? People are going to come to their senses because we have a pandemic or we have an economic crisis or we have, a crypto fascist demagogue in the Oval Office. I mean, I guess like I'm thinking of like, okay, I was voting a couple weeks ago and like there were these dudes behind me who were talking very vocally and publicly about their DSA organizing effort.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't sound like any
Yeah, no.
organizing is taking place. It sounds like they're
Yeah.
just kind of I don't know, talking to themselves and jerking themselves off to the sound of
Oh,
their own
yeah.
voices
Yeah.
and Zoom chats, kind of like we're doing, I guess. But it's
No,
like,
not really. I mean, I've been in those ones. They're different.
and so they just, where was I going with that? Okay, so like, let's say you right now you're really mad that Trump got reelected and you want to win the working class back and blah blah blah. So you sign up for DSA and you start attending meetings and you wait another 4 years and you try to put forth another candidate who's going to do this, to me, all that's a waste of time. And it's that same abdication of personal responsibility that has created other problems for
Oh,
us.
for sure. Yeah.
I'm with you. I'd like to see that
But
happen in the future. I'd like to see a democratic socialist America, but I worry that like making that the priority option promotes this same form of passive politics that keeps getting idiots elected. And
mm,
that's
I
where I
don't, yeah.
think where I like the message your book kind of ends on is just this there is more of a kind of traditional Jeffersonian American call to local community personal responsibility and I think that's got to be kind of the bedrock and I do think people can start working on that now. You don't have to wait 4 more years to vote to start changing
Right.
the world, right?
Right. Well, I mean, but here's where the message of the first part of the book maybe can help address this. Believe it or not, Trump Republicans could become Democratic socialists.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So like so I'm not like banking on the actual like few like guys at the Democratic Socialist Convention to like get that job done. And I do agree that like what as far as what we can do as persons in our actual context. We shouldn't wait for that kind of political change to happen. We should be doing what we can. And we should, I mean, one of the aspects that's necessary for actual social change is grassroots organizing, community organizing, for want of a better word, which the Catholic worker does, and which we can do without any sort of movement. I don't actually fully identify with the Catholic worker movement. I admire it and I support it, but in my own life, I do things, to develop community with my friends, with my neighbors, and I think that's absolutely essential. But I don't think I would. There's more than one way that one can get to democratic socialism or something like it, and one way is the destabilization of the political system, which is what's happening right now, which can lead to a lot of change very rapidly. We hope it's democratic, but I never would imagine that the way to democratic socialism would be for actual Democratic Socialist Party to make the case to take over the Democratic Party or something like that, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you look at how change happens in other countries, and we're no exception, things get sometimes really bad. There's a lot of unrest. Everything's up for grabs. Sometimes bad things happen. Lots of bad things happen. The whole system is destabilized. What we've come to know changes, and sometimes what arises is something that actually is quite different and that you can actually work with. And I would just say a lot of the reasons why people are Trump supporters probably has to do with what I've been talking about. The radical insecurity, precarity, anxiety, distrust of authorities, distrust of people who are talking down to other people, and those people are obviously open. They don't actually have a strong ideological sense. They definitely love Donald Trump, but they don't actually have a real well worked out program of, you know, here's the problem, here's what we should do about it. Here's what the final vision should be. Those are people that are very ripe for change. So we are at an inflection point, which probably won't be taken advantage of, but where actual change could occur. So we shouldn't be looking at this moment as, oh my God, we just have to endure this for the next 4 years. This is a kind of a hopeful time, potentially. It's scary, but it's hopeful.
As a way to end this interview, where do you find the hope, and in what ways are you leaning to try and accentuate the possibilities of our moment?
Well, I mean, I find hope in my neighbor who is a Trump supporter. I've had multiple conversations with her, and she's very consistent that one of the things that she voted for Trump for was because she wanted our troops to be out of most of the world where we didn't belong and where we were wasting money and time and lives. And that is not the only person I've talked to with that orientation who just feels as though we are overextending ourselves and a lot of money and time and lives are being spent in conflicts where we don't belong. I find that hopeful. I do. I think there are a lot of other reasons why people situate themselves as she has, which maybe have a little less validity, but honestly, they're right to the extent that the Democratic Party has become what do you want to call it? Not warlike, hawkish. It's hawkish, to be sure. It's hawkish. And it's pretty conservative, too. And so, I find, that those types of exchanges kind of inspire me. I don't think everybody who has become angry enough to vote a protest vote is completely, they have some things right, I guess. I don't know. What was the other part of your question?
What are you specifically doing to accentuate, to leverage the opportunities you're afforded?
Okay. Well, I do have somebody living in my basement for free that's paying off his student debt. So I'm not a Catholic worker in the sense that I have somebody who is without resources, but a lot of people in our society are, um, not getting ahead in life and not able to actually establish themselves in the world because they're going to pay student debt for like the majority of their life. And so we are actually living in community where, we trade resources and we trade labor and, so I mean, that's some, and then I reach out to my neighbors, right? And I'm taking care of my father instead of having him in a elderly care facility. So every single day I talk to him, I see him, I make sure he's okay. I fix his technological problems. I drive him when I need to, even though he drives on his own. And of course, I'm going to Kansas City at least once a month, and I'm cooking for you guys, and I'm, like doing a little bit of work on the farm when I can, and, trying to support you guys in the Morin Academy. Um, and, I looked at, and then I have a full-time job. And I've published 2 articles, like multiple like book reviews, so a whole bunch of publishing plus this book. Uh, and just like looking at, every year we have to do an annual evaluation. And I'm looking at what I'm doing. And I'm like, how the heck did I get that much done? This is insane. I need to stop. There's no way I can get like enough. So, so I'm like on overdrive actually. And I'm happy and I'm thriving and I've met new people and I have so like I guess what I'm saying is I think I'm doing quite a bit, but is any of this like programmatically leading to like the specific goal? No. However, I think if more people did one of those two first things I mentioned, if you've got a home, take somebody else into it that could benefit from like living cooperatively. If you can afford to give them a break and like start to value other aspects of other people's what they can give, such as time and work, do that. Like take a little bit of a chance. Let somebody into your home. And then another thing would be like if you've got an elderly parent who isn't in need of really heavy duty physical aid, don't like look forward to the day when you put them in a nursing home prematurely so that you can do whatever you want. But like think about how you can help them out and still, with some compromises, live your own life. So those are the things I'm doing. And I guess one message, I don't know if it came out in the book, but I hope so, but I'll say it here, is that if you try these types of things, your life will be so much better, right? Like you will be happier. You will be so much more interested in what you're doing. Even if you're overworked and stressed out, it's far better to like do that and to sort of be alive to the extent that you can be in this crazy system we have than to kind of just lay back and, go to work, come home, buy shit, it's like, so it's very enlivening and it's worth taking. And by the way, like I have had several people in my basement apartment and I went through several failures and situations that weren't ideal. So, it's not always easy to share your space with other people. But that's what Catholic workers do, except for they mainly do that with people who don't have any money at all, right? But there's no reason why other people couldn't do what I'm doing, right, in their own context if they don't if they can't, psychologically or emotionally deal with bringing a homeless person into their home. That doesn't mean that you can't do that or you can't like heavily cooperate with your neighbors, as I do with the Trump advocate over here, who like actually we do like trade and cooperate on things and have we have each other's back. We do. We do. So yeah, like that's, I guess that's what I would say I'm doing, and what I would think, like you, Spencer, have more, I guess, legitimacy in the Catholic worker area space with the Catholic worker farm, which is I love and support. So maybe you could speak to that too before we end. We got to go pretty soon, I suppose, but like, how do you feel about what you're doing?
I don't know. I think we maybe leave that for the discussion in the Grange later this month.
Okay. I mean, that's legit.
Hunt for now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Caleb had a final question.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of end on, like, you and I both work with young people and are in the kind of uncomfortable position of having to advise them on what do you do next, and having to, I don't want to say lie, but arguably mislead them about state of the world and, potential course of their life, And I think you and I both, I mean, I agree with much of what you've written in the book, and see institutional ideological failure all over the place. And often think the best I can do personally is just model what, you know, hope and charity can look like in the context of all of this, right? But they are making college and career decisions, and there are better and worse options among those. And of course, I'm always advising them, don't stop there, look past your career and, starting now, right? Take ownership for your world and yada, yada, yada. But I guess a lot of even the better intentioned among them, many of whom are already, you know, um, engaging in some of the mutual aid and service opportunities that we'd like to see them participate in, and they're volunteering. And, they still, even the best ones, have deeply flawed ideas about what it means to do good in the world and how you do that. These are people with oftentimes ambitions in politics or law. And, the most tragic thing, no offense, is when they go off and major in political science because they want to do good in the world, right? And of course,
I'm not taking that, Caleb.
I
No.
like
Nope.
what you do, political theory, much better
Nope.
than like the quasi science of whatever they're teaching in political science. But
Right. Actually,
uh,
no, no.
and then they want to go do policy work for the governor, or they want to,
All right.
join somebody's campaign. And I guess if you accept the thesis of your book, much of that effort is not only misguided, but potentially kind of insidiously harmful, or at least not helping things. So what can we encourage them to do as a matter of just practical career pursuits, to, you know, help make things?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, political science is no worse than any other like field that people could go into, and sometimes I would say better. And lots of our students go into law, so the conversation that I have with them is what kind of law, right? Because everything is kind of like somewhat relative in this capitalist space, right? So like it really does matter if you go into contract law or, whether you go into like human rights law. It does. And so, like, I always have that conversation with them about what do you actually value? Like, what's actually important to you? And a lot of students will say, I don't know. And then our conversation kind of leads them down that path of, how can you use this ability that you have to actually help people? Now, it may be like relative and marginal or whatever, but actually lawyers can help people dramatically in the system that we have, right? So I would push back on the comment about political science. I think that actually students that go into political science,
No.
they
And I
can
guess
be
my
quite
advice is,
impactful.
if you want to be a lawyer, major in philosophy, but that's just I'm partial.
Not at all. No, I disagree with that as well. I mean, students can take like philosophy, but and they should while they get their political science degree, but actually we teach about law and constitutional law and administrative law. So I mean, it shouldn't surprise you. I'm an advocate of political science. I am a political scientist.
Yeah.
I've been in business for 30 years, and I truly believe that this discipline that I went into is actually impactful. Part of the reason why Spencer is here is because he took my classes. And yeah, like political philosophy is kind of a sub-discipline of it, but the overall discipline is, and most of the people in it are aimed at like pushing people in public service towards something good. I teach administrative ethics, for instance, and the whole course is about getting people in public administration to think ethically. So they think about the common good, whether it's in, their evaluation of technological systems and artificial intelligence, or in public aid, seeing past race, seeing racism and systemic racism and sexism and ageism and all of those things that, get in the way of equally serving people, thinking about how they can contribute to, the public debate in a positive way. So, I mean, I think the way that we train them, and I can only speak for myself and my colleagues, is very positive. And how do we intervene? We intervene by constantly talking to our students about their values and the fact that they should be value driven, right? Like that they shouldn't go into a field because they're going to make money. They should go into a field because they care about this, right? And especially if they're highly intelligent, then they really have a responsibility to, like, when they choose their field of service, to like go into one that actually benefits other human beings. Otherwise, they are an advantage taker, right? And, we certainly have lawyers like that, but without lawyers on the other side that actually provide defenses for people who deserve defending, and defend human rights, well, the world would be even a worse place. So I think it's there's different levels of action, right? Like, or of aspiration. There's the ideal, right? And this is where everybody gets hung up, and they look at somebody like me as some sort of hypocrite, or, like compromised or whatever. But there's actually different levels of conversation, right? There's the ideal. Then there's this intermediate space of like, what do you aspire to? And then there's the tactical reality of the world, right? And at the tactical reality of the world, you may encourage somebody to be a lawyer who goes and defends people against doctors who take advantage and or kill people, for instance, or, you know, laws that treat people inhumanely, right? Or not equally, prejudicial laws. So, yeah, like I think that I'm going to offering a fairly full-throated defense of my own discipline, as well as like the academic pursuit generally, in that we can think multi-level, and one thing doesn't necessarily contradict another. So the fact that I spend a lot of time talking to people about how to get into a career and how to orient themselves in that law career or business career doesn't mean that we're like value rudderless, right? Like we have like actual ethical values, and we're trying to like live them out in
Yeah.
our profession, right?
And then I guess one thought is like, how do we have those conversations in a way that does not appeal to kind of the language of progressive optimism that seems to be breaking down and increasingly losing its sway on kids, because I mean, we're talking about a generation that has just been inured to chaos and dysfunction and a degradation of political speech, who, they strike me as very, very cynical to the point that it's nearly self-defeating. And so, some of the old platitudes around, making the world a better place, don't seem to have the kind of normative appeal that they once might have. And so, then it's just, well, all right, it's all fucked, so I'm gonna go make a bunch of money and consume my way into oblivion, right? And so I guess and this is not just what I'm advising students, but what I'm thinking about and what I've had to think about in my case too as an educator is how can we justify the work without appeal to the narratives of liberal progress that I think increasingly are just untenable. And to me, the language of, like in my case, right? You work in the education system and you realize immediately that all of the um, optimism you were shot up with going into it, right, is misguided. If you want to change the world, the last place you should start is a school, because
Yeah.
structurally, at least, now if you want to change a life, work in a school. But if you
Well,
want
that
to
the two
change,
are the same. The two are the
yeah,
same.
and I agree, two sides of the same coin. But
Yeah.
institutionally and systemically, you're just crushed under the weight of
Yeah,
bureaucracy,
well, but are you
powerless.
crushed, right? Like, or can you? So, so all I can say is I just deal with the human beings that are before me, right? Like the number one thing is to see the person that's there in front of you, not the project, not the goal, not the aspirations, but that actual human being. And they all vary. Now, the person who just comes to me and says, I don't give a shit, I don't care about any of these standards, I just want my ticket punched, I just don't give them any time. They can go elsewhere, right? But if I'm dealing with and most people are not that. Most people are dealing with the two things. They want to do something kind of good for the world, but they also want to be secure, both of which are totally understandable. So then you try to help them figure that out, right? Like you try to help them figure out how you can do both of those things. And yes, it's a compromise. I mean, that's the reality of our situation. But actually, most of the students that I deal with who are talking about like what they want to do with their future are not cynical manipulators who just want to make money. They're not like, but they are kind of anxious about not falling through the cracks too, right? So I'm not advocating for them to go off and do something which I don't even believe in, like Peace Corps or some such shit as that. Like, I'm actually advocating for them to get a job in whatever job they do to be ethical, to try to do as much good within that position as they possibly can, and hopefully, with some of them who are highly intelligent, to be able to use their career to generally aim at something better. But you've got to take every person as they come. And see, I mean, by the time they get to me, they're not children anymore. They're other adults, right? Like they may be young, but they're adults. And so, I I look at them as other adults, right? And as human beings who are making choices and can have an adult conversation. And so it's a little different on that score. So I don't feel like I have to lie to them or not lie to them. I'm, I'm having conversation with them where they come to me and say, this is kind of what I want to do. And if it's really kind of just utilitarian, I'll say, okay, like, if you could, what would you actually like to do? Right. And for people who are really like super naive, which I very rarely encounter, actually. Like, in fact, it's been a long time since I did. But if I did, like, I would say, now, wait a minute, you probably can't do that. You probably aren't going to be able to quite do that. Let's talk about like, okay, like maybe you can, but like let's come up with plan B in case you can't, because the world is like this. So I do have conversations with students occasionally about what the world is actually like, right? And then, I mean, it's up to them as to where to take that next in my case, because I'm dealing with people over 18, if that makes sense. So we're a
Yeah.
little.
Yeah, and I guess, and we don't have to follow this thread, but I've wondered too, if there's like where are the lines or like the non-negotiables in terms of how we're advising kids if we're trying to promote the sort of vision we get in the book, right? It does seem to me that certain paths of life are completely incompatible with what
Yeah,
it means to live a good, fully human life, even if you're doing it in the best way possible with,
for sure.
yeah,
Right. But sometimes that's what people have to do to survive too.
sure.
And
But then
so,
likewise,
yeah.
it also seems to me that they're, I mean, I also have great students who are great people and want to be artists and stuff. And I struggle with that too because I don't want to fall into, like neoliberal utilitarian arguments around that, isn't you're not gonna make money and you're not gonna do any good with that. On the other hand, I also feel like sometimes that can be kind of a self-indulgent, like, yeah, that's the point. I'm not gonna serve anybody besides myself, and I'm gonna
Right.
kind of like me, honestly, like getting my three liberal arts degrees, that wasn't for anybody but me. And I've managed to make some good come of it. But
Sometimes people can be artists too. That's the thing you have to keep remembering is
yeah,
like
yeah,
there are people that are talented enough and are there at the right time, and they do become these, people
right.
who actually can't. So, and it's not totally predictable either. So it's not to totally be sneezed at, right? Like, I don't deal with too many people who want to be artists because of my particular field, but I don't know. Like I've struggled with it. I don't want to yeah, I don't want to totally throw like water on that because sometimes
Right.
that does happen and people really have something extraordinary to offer. And ultimately it is their life. And if they can't make it, then they learn from that, right? They learn from that. And then they do something else, right? Or they modify their goals. And that's up to them because they're free people that can do that. So I mean, yeah, that's all I can say. I would hate. I don't want to. I wouldn't want to give people the false message that they absolutely can't do something like that because sometimes they can, and we're the
Sure.
beneficiaries of
Yeah.
that. Like for real, our lives are
Oh,
enriched.
absolutely. Right. A world without art is an impossible.
Yeah, yeah, right, yeah.
Um,
And if you don't believe in yourself, you'll never make it. You'll never do it, right? Like my own sister made amazing art, right? But she didn't believe in herself. She didn't have self-confidence, even enough to like share it with other people, let alone to put it out there for the general public, right? But actually, she was just as good of an artist as a lot of people I've seen in galleries. Okay. So I don't know. Like everybody's life is their own past a certain point, and it's not a horrible catastrophe if somebody follows their dreams and then they realize their dreams aren't quite going to make it. At least they tried. You only have one life to live. You might as well try, in my view, if you really believe in something. So, and I don't feel like my responsibility is to like decide their fate for them because it's their responsibility and their fate, right? Like I'm not the person who ultimately gets to decide that.
I guess, how about this for a final question? So given the discussion about people making choices and fate and whatever, how do you feel that this is would it be fair to say this is the most mature work you've ever put out, and what has it meant for you?
Yeah, it is, right? It's the culmination of a lot of research and, of course, all the stuff that I've gathered in the past, I don't know, 8 years or so of dealing with you and Jacob Honshu and the Morin Academy folks. And it's also me attempting to take that, what I've absorbed of all that, and bring it to a general audience. So it is not the most academic work I've ever written, which in my aspiration has always been to not just write for an academic audience. Uh, so so yes, I think so. I've got more definitely left to do, but this is definitely, I'm more pleased with this book and also with the publisher than I've ever been before. And Whippenstock is, and they took a long time with getting the book out, but it's a good publisher, and its audience is a good audience. So I'm very encouraged by that.
All right. Well, thank you for publishing it, and thanks for fielding these questions this past
Thank you
hour and a
for,
half.
yeah, thanks for having me. I mean, well, which is kind of silly to say because it's our podcast in a way, but thanks for,
Really, Caleb, thank you for having us.
yeah, right. Like Caleb, thanks for being our guest.
Yeah, and sorry for bashing political science.
Well, I should have forewarned you. I am an extreme advocate of political science.